Welcome to Policy for the People, a show that explores the public policies that can lift up all Oregonians. This show is a collaboration between KMUZ Radio and the Oregon Center for Public Policy. I am your host, Juan Carlos Ordóñez. May 1 is International Workers' Day, a day that honors the sacrifice and victories of organized labor. It's a holiday in just about every country around the world, but not here in the U.S. Even though the date is a recognition of a historic and bloody strike in 1886 involving hundreds of thousands of workers in the U.S., mainly in the city of Chicago, these striking workers were demanding an 8-hour workday. While it took some time, organized labor eventually won the 8-hour workday, something that many of us today take for granted. As history shows time and time again, the power of working people comes from being able to act collectively, according to Don McIntosh, our guest in this special episode of Policy for the People. Don is the editor of the Northwest Labor Press, which reports on the labor movement in Oregon, the Pacific Northwest, as well as developments nationally. Founded in 1900, the Northwest Labor Press is one of America's oldest and last remaining labor movement newspapers. I spoke with Don about the present state of the labor movement, what the Trump administration means for organized labor, and the policy changes that would remove the barriers that workers face when seeking to form a union. Here is my conversation with Don McIntosh. Don, welcome to Policy for the People.
Thanks for having me.
Don, could you share a little bit with our listeners about the Northwest Labor Press, its history, and what you're currently focusing on?
Absolutely. Well, so it's an unusual sort of paper. It's an independent labor union owned newspaper that provides news to the labor union community in our area, which is Oregon and Southwest Washington. Right now, we go out twice a month in print to about 45,000 union households. And we estimate that when you add in the spouses and roommates and so forth, potentially reach about 140,000 people. There used to be papers like this quite a bit around the country. Now, I think there's only about 7 left, but I feel like it's a newspaper with a mission. Our goal obviously is always to be fair and accurate, but we also we have a perspective where we believe that the union movement is a vital force and worth supporting, and so we're reporting about both the activities of our local labor movement and also just sort of the things that matter to working people as working people.
So you mentioned that there used to be a lot more papers focusing on the labor movement, but not as many today. Why is it important for there to be publications that focus exclusively on what's going on in the labor movement?
Very often, quite frankly, working people that might be in a union don't necessarily hear about the union day in and day out. And so, at the minimum, when you're getting this publication, you're reminded that you're a union member. And not only that, but to the extent that people are aware of being in a union, they might still be in a little silo or not know what other unions are doing. And so when you get a paper like ours, you're actually coming into contact with, understanding that your organization is part of a larger moral movement for justice and dignity and security for working people. And I just feel like that it creates a community and it expands your consciousness.
How would you describe the current state of the labor movement here in Oregon and nationally?
Well, we're in a very interesting moment, I think, in the medium term and certainly in the short term. I feel like we are in a moment of great opportunity because the polls in recent years are consistently telling us that, by and large, in the public, the support for unions is at its highest level in over 60 years. And I think that's really telling because I think it's a signal that people understand that the economic system we live in is not just, and that maybe there's real value in having unions and being in a union. So, that's looking at above 60-70% of public support. So that's very encouraging. And in fact, I would add, when you drill down into those numbers, it's actually the younger workers who are most likely to say they're pro-union, even though those are also the least likely to be in a union. So generally speaking, if you have younger people wanting what you are, that's probably a good sign for growth in the future. The problem is that wanting union or supporting union is different than becoming a member of a union, and there are so many difficulties and obstacles, sort of legally and structurally to doing that because of employer opposition and the weak law. But also, frankly, we don't live in a time where people are used to coming together around anything. There are, so the idea of collective action, of collective membership, this is a little bit alien anymore. And of course, I never say never. Change is constant and it may come back. I certainly hope it will. But I think translating that sort of latent support into actual, joining and becoming members and active in unions, that's a big challenge. I've been now basically, what amounts to a reporter on the labor beat for 20, 26, 27 years. And for a long time, it was, I don't want to say maybe a little depressing, a year after year, labor declining, and that's been the case. But I think in recent years, I've just seen an increase in activity and organizing activity, an increase in enthusiasm, in involvement. That's really notable. That said, unfortunately, still it's not translating into an increase in the percentage of workers, for example, in the United States who are union members. So that's a problem. And now there's a new obstacle, which is this guy in the White House. Very interesting, a long story. We could spend the whole time talking about that. But he really is taking some measures to that are going to harm the union movement. And the biggest of all, it was basically a couple of weeks ago, an executive order that stripped about 1 million federal workers of their fairly limited union rights. But as a union busting move, it's really unprecedented in U.S. history.
So in 2023, so this was just a couple of years ago, you could hear the phrase the summer of strikes being used. And there were a lot of notable strikes that summer and into the fall. And we're talking about United Auto Workers, writers and actors in Hollywood, healthcare workers at Kaiser Permanente. Do you think that level of energy that we saw a couple of years ago is still here?
Yeah, to some extent. It's funny. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, they track what they call large work stoppages, but basically strikes that involve more than 1,000 workers. And you can see this really dramatic trend. First of all, you had really the most active strike movement, the most active organized working class in the world in the United States in the 1950s, where you had 400 to 500 large strikes a year. And these were big deal strikes, strikes that could shut down the economy in some cases. That really continued a fairly high level of strike activity through the 50s, through the 60s, even into the 70s, without pretty much noticeable dip until you pretty much hit a wall at the very end of the 1970s and early 80s, and then it drops dramatically and continues to drop until by the 2000s, the strike is almost a thing of the past. We had, I believe, the low point was somewhere in the mid 2000s where there were like 5 or 6 large strikes a year. Again, compared to that period of 1940s and 50s where there'd been 400 plus. So you just see how unbelievably, you see the strike disappearing. That narrative has changed somewhat since 2008, 2009, when we started with the red state teachers strikes, large numbers of teachers walking out for, basic kinds of improvements in K-12 education. But then we've really seen a sort of a new level of strike activity since then, to where, going back to that Bureau of Labor Statistics number, you're looking at 20 to 30 or maybe 40 large strikes a year. And of course, large strikes is only one part of the analysis, and you have to think about small strikes too. But unfortunately, they stopped measuring that in the early 1980s.
What's your sense as to why this long-term decline in the strike activity? You said it began around the 1980, and here we are today with very low levels, relatively speaking, of strikes. Why do you think this happened?
Well, I'm sure it's a combination of things, but I think, I guess everyone seems to want to point to the 1981 strike by the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, PATCO. These were federal employees who were air traffic controllers, and it was illegal for them to strike. But by the way, back then, that didn't necessarily matter. You showed your power by striking, and then they figured it out afterwards. But in this case, they struck, and Ronald Reagan, who had said when he was running for office, he went to their union and got their endorsement because he said he supported their aims. He said, well, if you don't go back to work, like tomorrow or the next day, you're all fired. And they didn't believe that, and that's what happened. And so he basically fired them all. And I think that really set a tone that it was time to get tough. Employers had never really maybe accepted the legitimacy of having to bargain with anyone to determine what they were going to pay their employees, how they were going to treat their employees. And so I think that sort of maybe served as an invitation for employers to bust unions. And they would do things like they would, in negotiations, which they were obliged to do, they would give proposals that really they knew that the workers couldn't accept. And so they had some really just deadly, really difficult strikes in the early 1980s. And I think what happened in that time is that you got this narrative, this feeling among working people that striking was a very dangerous thing. You could lose your job, and it was likely to be unsuccessful. And so I think there became a lot of fear and hesitancy around striking at that time. I think striking is in so many ways a great example of nothing succeeds like success. I think when no one in your life has ever struck before, it may sound like a scary thing. But if you see other people striking and getting dramatic gains, then you're like, well, I want some of that too. Doesn't that sound? I mean, I don't know about fun, but like they're truly transformative moments. They're moments that people remember all their lives. Where normally you just sort of going to work and doing what the boss says, and all of a sudden for a day or a week or 40 days, you're out there on the line with your coworkers, spending all day long with the people you work with, but getting to sort of form an organization, forming a unified sort of body.
If you're just joining us, you're listening to Policy for the People. I'm speaking with Don McIntosh about the current state of the labor movement. Don is the editor of the Northwest Labor Press and has been covering the labor movement for more than 2 decades. Since you've been covering the labor movement for a while now, have you seen shifts in the kinds of industries that are generating more labor activity, more labor organizing, perhaps even striking?
Absolutely. Well, I mentioned the poll earlier about how support is very high. The part I forgot to mention was, of course, it's the young. It's also the educated. This is a shift. It's a significant shift. The more education you have now, the more likely you are to say that you support or approve of unions. And we're seeing that where you have workforces that are both young and highly educated, the rates of unionization are quite high. And so, for example, graduate students and even now undergraduate students, if you so much as work in a cafeteria and you're an undergraduate student at a university, decent chance that you're either unionized or thinking about unionizing. It's certainly the case with graduate employees, with scientific researchers at universities. In our area, Oregon Health and Science University has seen just really an incredible explosion of unionizing in the last 5 to 10 years. Soon they may be something like what we call wall to wall, entirely union. But group after group has basically said, "Oh, it's our time. We're going to unionize." So yeah, I do think that's one area. Of course, you probably know there have been interesting sort of experiments in some non-traditional terrain for unionizing, like for example, Starbucks is a good example. But I think unfortunately, it's been very difficult for them to get that first contract. It's one thing to have several hundred Starbucks stores formally say that they want to be in a union, which is extraordinary. I don't want to say otherwise. I mean, who would have thought that was going to happen 5 or 10 years ago? That has happened. But then figuring out how to get that company to give a reasonable contract is not something that they've solved just yet.
You mentioned the Trump administration earlier and what a threat it is to the labor movement. I wonder if you can say more about what else the administration is planning with regards to the labor movement, or what are the threats it poses to the labor movement beyond its executive action versus federal workers.
It's a funny thing because Trump is very unusual for Republicans, let's say. Trump really has made some overtures to labor. He's had the building trades unions in the Oval Office for meetings. He met with the Teamsters. He seems to want to appeal to unions that are more along the sort of traditional working class unions, because to some extent those are his base. I mean, if you look at people without a college education, who was one definition of working class, those people do now vote for Republicans and for Trump in much greater numbers than they used to, and in fact the majority of them, I think, at this point are in that camp. So he's not wrong when he says, your members support me. But the problem is that when you look at the policies, I do think that most unions are nonpartisan ultimately, and they would be glad to have both parties sort of competing for their allegiances. And unfortunately, we have had a Republican Party that's gotten more and more anti-union. Now, Trump has actually reversed that in small ways, but unfortunately, too many of the things we've seen in the first 100 days don't look good for unions. So, for example, he's put people in some of the offices, like, for example, the person that's up for confirmation to run OSHA, the worker safety organization. That's someone who worked in safety at Amazon. So it's not exactly a model of worker safety, unfortunately. There's these just sort of spectacular and dramatic executive orders that you never saw coming. For example, no one's ever heard of the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, probably. But the reality is that this is a tiny independent federal agency that has, several hundred, mediators that help resolve labor disputes when an important union and employer can't come to agreement. He just basically laid them off, all but like a dozen of them. So that's, and there are a number of cases like that. Certainly the attack on the federal workforce, which you can hardly. I mean, we could take an entire segment, I'm sure, and talk just about that. But the indignity of sending them emails saying, you'd be better off in the private sector. How about you resign and get a few months of pay? And then the dishonesty of these layoffs of probationary employees, where it says, here is a directive from on high to local management says, fire all these people and tell them it was for performance. But it's just a lie. It's not true. And so you're looking at tens of thousands, probably more, decent public employees in the federal workforce who are just being let go en masse. It's almost hard to keep up. In fact, we're a local newspaper, really, the Northwest Labor Press. Most of we're focused on our local labor movement, the things that are happening in our area. But since Inauguration Day, an enormous amount of my time has been spent just keeping up with all of the actions of the White House.
You also mentioned before that we're seeing a lot more labor organizing within college educated folks, even graduate workers. Do you think we need to redefine what it means to be part of the working class? Do you think that, today the working class should include, all workers, including well-educated workers, because economic insecurity is so widespread?
Well, I mean, that term working class, I think, has probably been sort of in contention for a while. I mean, if you look at like someone like Karl Marx, one of the original economists, he defines working class as having to do with your relationship to the means of production. So basically, if you work for a living, then you're working class. If you own for a living, then you're not working class. Most people work for a living, whether it's, a PhD, a scientific researcher, or a construction laborer. Are they both in the working class? Well, sure. But, do they have the same perspective, outlooks, work environments? Well, maybe not. And so this idea of, of working class that's sort of more of a sociological definition that sort of says, well, it's everyone you associate with as sort of a peer or similar to you. And so in that case, I think there is somewhat of a cultural divide. There's a cleavage in our society between people who have, a college education or a substantial amount of education and people who don't. And I think that's very painful, especially for the union movement, which is really ultimately about uniting all working people. And if working people aren't united because they're divided over cultural issues, or they have different outlooks because maybe they do or don't have education, that's a painful problem for the labor movement to solve.
So you mentioned before the high levels of approvals for unions, but that union membership is very low right now relative to what it used to be. What do you think needs to happen for the labor movement to gain strength, to regain the power that it once had to broadly lift up wages and working conditions?
Well, I think that's a question that probably 10,000 people who are, or more who have their lives invested in the union movement are all trying to think of the answer to. And it's one that they've been grappling for, trying to come up with the answer to, for decades. I look at, in some ways, the really long-term trends and just wonder whether there are sorts of forces and conditions that are somewhat beyond our control. So I'm not meaning to propose any kind of fatalism. I do think, there is free will. We can come together. We can, oftentimes, if you look at like the 1920s, that was a very dark period in labor history. And, in many ways, the labor movement that had formed previous to that was in retreat. And maybe you would look around and say, oh, it's defeated. And yet it came surging back in the 1930s in a big way. And so I think that is often, the trick that history plays on us is that, it's always darkest before the dawn. The trouble is you don't necessarily know when the dawn is. And so, is the labor movement going to come back next year, the year after, 10 years from now, 100? I don't know. I mean, I think in a way, we were looking at what we thought of as normal being actually pretty rare in historical terms, like the period of the post-World War II period where with broadly shared prosperity and powerful unions, that's pretty rare unfortunately, in human history. Most of human history consists of a very tiny number of people pretty much owning everything and everyone else working for them and paying them rent. And I'm very concerned that that's the direction that we've been heading now for the last 40 or 50 years, not just the United States, but globally. So, what will it take to get working people to come back? I wish I knew the answer. I don't think it's outright deprivation, because there are places in the world where people will starve to death before taking collective action to right themselves by improving their conditions, by and organizing. So I don't know the answer, but I think one of the roles I feel like someone who is in the labor press, what we do, and I think anyone who's attached to the labor movement is, when you see an ember, when you see a spark, do whatever you can to fan the flames. When a strike is happening, put it out on the line and help them succeed, because it's only that kind of thing. I'm convinced that the strike is a necessary ingredient for a comeback of labor. We need to have, whether it's UPS or the United Auto Workers, setting examples of saying, well, it looks like the employer said they couldn't give us a $3 an hour raise, but we went on strike for 3 weeks and they realized they were mistaken. Like that, showing that kind of power, which we still have, that power still exists. If for example, this million federal workers that just got their rights stripped from them, what if they went on strike? What if they went on strike? Congress comes to a crisis, a national crisis, when they can't come together and agree on funding the government. Well, what if the government just shut down because the workers went on strike? Now, surely some of those agencies wouldn't be missed, fine, but there's a lot of public services that Americans rely on, and that would create a crisis. So I feel like that power is still there. It's the mechanism for how to use it, to how to demonstrate it, that's lacking. Like the ability to have that strike right now, we don't seem to be able to have. Now, in France, if they try to take away your retirement or make changes you don't approve of, they seem to have a habit of going out in large numbers and shutting down the country, whether it's the airports or the trains or the trash service or you name it. They have a feisty sort of tradition. I wish we were more like that, and maybe we will be again one day. As I said, we were the strikiest working class in the 1940s and 50s.
If you're just joining us, you're listening to Policy for the People. And in this episode, we're taking a look at the challenges and opportunities facing the labor movement. I'm speaking with Don McIntosh, editor of the Northwest Labor Press. Here is the rest of our conversation. You touched on this briefly earlier, that there are structural problems when it comes to the ability of workers to organize. I'm wondering what you think would be the most important changes, policy changes that are needed to make it possible for workers to come together and form unions, and be it policy changes at the federal or state level.
First, there was a version called the Employee Free Choice Act, and then later it was called the Protect the Right to Organize Act, or PRO Act. There are some pieces of legislation that would be fantastic, that really could help change the fortunes of labor. And those have to do with taking labor law seriously, enforcing the law. Like right now, if you try to unionize in your workplace, your employer can fire you. Now that's illegal, but it might take 2 or 3 years before you get a wage settlement, and by then you're gone and the union is crushed. There's no penalties actually. There's only make whole remedies, like whatever wages you lost, minus wages you made in the meantime. I mean, it's a disgraceful labor law in terms of there's really not an incentive for the employer to an employer who doesn't want to follow the law isn't really going to face any kind of significant consequences. And so they have little dictatorships where they bring in an anti-union consultant and try and talk you out of the union and demoralize you and do all sorts of dirty tricks, and many of them illegal. And again, as I say, face no consequence. So the PRO Act gets tough on those kinds of employer abuses. It also does something very important, which is it's called first contract binding arbitration. Basically, the underlying premise of American labor law with collective bargaining is that both sides are supposed to get together in good faith and try and hammer out an agreement that works for both parties that they can agree with. That very often doesn't happen in a newly unionized workforce. The employer could just say, no, not interested. And then what do? Well, if you can strike, maybe then you have some leverage. But very oftentimes there's not a good faith effort, I think, by an employer in a first union contract situation. The PRO Act would actually force a binding arbitration, and an arbitrator would listen to both sides and decide what was reasonable. And there are a dozen other really terrific improvements that proposed reform makes. The trouble is, it's been damnably hard to get it passed. I think the Democratic Party has woken up a little bit late to the fact that its fortunes are tied to the fortunes of the labor movement, and there were opportunities, for example, maybe in the early Obama years, the first 2 years, where they might have passed something similar, and they didn't. I think too often in politics, I like to say the labor movement is thought of as the cash cow and the workhorse of the Democratic Party, but they're never in the driver's seat. They're never calling the shots. I mean, they're sort of like the ugly stepchild or something like that, some unpleasant metaphor. But basically, I haven't seen labor to be like the dominant force deciding in Democratic Party politics. It would be transformative if the PRO Act passes, but what are its chances? I'm not so sure. In Oregon, there's actually a very interesting and impressive reform that they're considering right now, I think, which would actually tip the scales a little bit towards fairness for working people. And it's, I believe it's SB 916. It would allow striking workers to collect unemployment benefits. And why that matters is right now, an employer can be really unreasonable and say, we want to, like they're doing at Bigfoot Beverages in Eugene. They're saying, here's our bargaining proposal. That pension that you have that guarantees you a monthly check for the rest of your life, we want to take that away and give you a 401k instead, and then you'll be at the mercy of the market. How's that for a proposal? Would you like that? And these workers said no, and then the employer, they were at a standoff. So the workers have been on strike since last fall. But the part of the strategy here is that the employers count on the ability to starve these folks out, and to there's an injustice there. Workers don't strike as a first resort. They don't do it for fun. It involves sacrifice, and they're giving up wages and disruption and risk. So I don't think that it's going to spur unreasonable demands by working people, but I think it will disinhibit employer misbehavior and employer greed if the state of Oregon says, you know what, you're on strike, we're going to give you unemployment benefits. So I think actually, weirdly enough, that would be potentially, I don't know if it's game changing, but certainly it would be a significant reform that I'm very hopeful that Democrats will deliver in Oregon.
Don, for people who want to read the Northwest Labor Press or want to learn more about the paper, where can they go?
You bet. So it's not hard to find. nwlaborpress.org is our website. And on there, you can sign up for our online edition, or even better, our paper edition, which comes out twice a month to your mailbox. And it's, it's $18 a year, basically, for union members, 24 for non-union, or if you like, as I say, in your email inbox for free. Would love to have your listeners get our publication.
Don, any final thoughts you want to share with us regarding the state of the labor movement today?
I think it's fundamentally about working people coming together and taking collective action. The whole premise of unions in the United States about collective bargaining and reaching agreement is not meaningful if there's no leverage. And the leverage comes from working people being able to act in unison, whether it's freaking out the boss because everyone wears a red T-shirt on a Tuesday, or wears a button, or marches down and delivers a petition, or maybe it's just a practice picket where all of the employees walk out at lunchtime and pick up signs and say, hey, guess what's coming? Or in the case of a strike, that they show that they're prepared to go on strike for what are reasonable demands at the bargaining table. I really think it's only that kind of organization and showing the potential for collective activity that could impact the employer that really is the secret sauce to winning contracts, and frankly, inspiring other workers to join a union in the first place. So without the ability to do that, to be organized and take action collectively, I don't necessarily see us turning around. But with it, I think we could absolutely. The power is still there if we take it.
Well, Don McIntosh, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening to Policy for the People. We will see you next time.